Hello and welcome to the Philippines. Why did I move to the Philippines and why did I stay? That's the topic today. I previously did many months here, a couple of years ago. I think I did a video on the topic, and I went back and watched that the other night and really wasn't happy with how that came across. Anyway, it had over 9,000 views. Uh, so I'm going to do a new one and focus in on a number of new things anyway. Number one, we all have our priorities in life. We all have our comfort levels. We all have our desires, our dreams. I became very interested in the Well, I became very interested in Asian cultures very young, uh, very early in my life, and I don't know why that is. Something about what I saw on the television, probably. It seemed like an exotic place. Uh, the people I saw, especially in particular, the ladies I saw, the Asian ladies on the television, seemed to appeal to me. As years went on, um, many of the girls that I dated in the USA were Asian. Uh, from Hainan, China, from Thailand, from Vietnam. I think I met one girl from Vietnam, from other parts of China, Taiwan, Japanese, and they had all been quote unquote Americanized or westernized, I guess you would say. They lived most, if not all, of their life in the USA, so they were westernized. I decided to play some clips of some of my travels during this little discussion, so that's what you're seeing, and they may have been included on some of my previous videos, but I'll put down the locations in the video so at least you know where they're at. And if you want to search those other videos, just type in like Malapascua Island and into my site, and you might be able to pull up those videos. Anyway, I even in high school, uh, we were given an assignment to do an oral report, get up in the class and do a presentation to the class about some subject. And I think it was an English class, as a matter of fact. And I did one about the Ming Dynasty. And I'm sure I bored the rest of the class to death. Uh, how many people in the world are interested in the Ming Dynasty? But anyway, that was my interest in Asian cultures. My major in college was history and geography, and I always liked geography and studying the world. And a big part of geography and history is people oriented, not land oriented, especially geography, human geography, how people move around the world, how they even in their own local areas, how they migrate, how they just the logistics of everything, like we're seeing here, the logistics of getting here, the Philippines made up of what 7,000 islands, getting people and food and motorbikes and fuel and everything you need from one area to the next. Logistics of that type of thing, and I even looked at getting into city planning, but that period of time, the U.S. was going through a big recession. Everybody was getting laid off of government jobs, teaching jobs. I never did date a Filipina until I came to the Philippines, interesting enough. In the 1980s, I took a trip to the Caribbean. I was married at the time, and me and my wife, actually, I won a trip to the Caribbean on a cruise ship and fell in love with the tropical climate, fell in love with the clear blue waters, and ever since then, especially, I in the back of my mind was the the desire to visit and or eventually move overseas someplace. Uh, I had a teaching degree. I actually had paperwork to go and teach in Australia, and that was a good opportunity back in 1973. Um, My wife at the time found out how far it was away from her mother, and she didn't like that idea at all. So anyway, we did not go to Australia. Would have been a great move in retrospect, I think. Anyway, as I got closer to retirement age, we'll move ahead many, many years here, and probably 10 years from retirement, I started seriously thinking about where am I going to retire? Some of the options are is in the USA. There are different parts of the USA. I thought about parts of Texas. I was living in the Phoenix, Arizona area uh, for a long time, and things you look at are cost of living, the culture of an area, and even in the USA, in every country, you go to different parts of countries, and it's different culture. The food is a little different. The accents are a little different. So it becomes a comfort level. What type of area do you want to live in? A rural area, a college town, a really big city. Uh, Many factors to consider. I started buying books and watching videos and subscribed to a magazine called International Living Magazine, and they cater more to the high-end type thing, and you can buy. They have seminars where you can go and learn about retiring different places. They make money through their seminars, through finder's fees if they put you in touch with lawyers and real estate brokers in different parts of the world. And I strongly looked at Central America, Costa Rica, and Panama, and I've talked to people who have visited there and have lived there, and you really need to, very important to learn Spanish, and that wouldn't be so hard. I know just a little bit of Spanish. Uh, Looked at Ecuador, even considered different parts of Europe. But in the end, my real big interest all my life has been Asia. So I started concentrating on studying the Asian cultures. Cost of living, culture, English, religion. You know, I was brought up in a Christian nation, Christian culture. Um, so I'm probably not going to be real comfortable in for instance, the Middle East, many of the Middle East countries. But I think I could. I've moved around the USA quite a bit, and I adapt fairly quickly. I survive, and so I think I could survive and adapt almost any place in the world. But the thing is, what do you want? You know, what are your priorities? What do you really want in life? And I was pretty sure I was going to go to Thailand. I had researched Thailand, and it looked like the place for me. In fact, I told one of the vloggers there that I'm going to see you in 6 months. I'm moving there. Made my mind up. And as I studied more and read more, I started understanding that more and more that many of the Thais do not speak English. Um, I looked at some of the language courses. The alphabet is completely different than English, and it probably wasn't going to be a case where I was going to learn very much Thai. Over time, you can learn a little bit of any language, but that just seemed like a difficult situation. And I started looking at other countries: Vietnam, Cambodia, other Southeast Asia countries. I had visited China about 10 years ago, and I think it would be fairly easy for me to get a job there if I really wanted to work. But with the new president there, he has become cracking down on it, a little more authoritarian than what I'm happy with. It is a communist country, um, so I decided to check that one off my list. I looked at Vietnam, considered Vietnam, and many of you know I've recently visited Vietnam, and they've got reasonably good infrastructure in much of the country. There again, most of the people do not speak English. if you lived in a community where there was an expat community, so that you had English-speaking friends that you could tap occasionally, that might work out. Cambodia, I think the infrastructure there is not as good as the Philippines, uh, but I think I could live there. I could adapt there. It would there again it would depend on what part of the country you lived in. Uh, so it really came down to the Philippines. And the more I read about the Philippines, the more videos I watched about the Philippines, and seeing how vloggers were interacting with the people, and the people seemed, many of the people had a pretty good grasp, reasonably good grasp of English. And so I started focusing in on the Philippines. One thing about the Philippines that is very important is that they're a welcoming country. They welcome tourists, they welcome expats. That's there's millions and billions of dollars spent every year by tourists and expats in the country. So they are focused on. They are very welcoming people. And once I got here, I was just really amazed at how friendly the people are. Uh, 95% of the people, or maybe more than that, just very friendly. Uh, People in most of the world, as you all know, I'm sure, you're walking down the street, walking in a mall, wherever, unless you're in a very small town where people know you, people do not make eye contact. They do not greet one another in many areas. I'm from Minnesota originally, and way many years ago they had one of the Olympics up there, and the term was coined Minnesota nice. Being nice isn't the same as being friendly, though. I, I met a guy from Switzerland some time ago. In fact, he was a Brit who was living in Switzerland and for many years, working there, and he told me the Swiss are very nice people, very polite people, but that doesn't mean that they're friendly. And some people are going to disagree with what I was told here, but then that's fine. That's part of the conversation. But he said, they're polite. They will give you directions. They will uh, help you out if they can. Uh, but they are not friendly in the sense that Filipinos are friendly. Many Filipinos will take the time and just really go out of their way to uh, answer your question, to help you out. That's been my experience. I've had them walk with me a couple blocks to find the area where the proper jeepney would stop to pick me up to where I wanted to go. During my first trip, I was here for 6 months. I had a 6 month lease on a condo, and then I went back to the USA. And when I came back a couple of months later, it was like I'm home. I felt just unbelievable feeling as the plane was coming in to land in the Philippines in Cebu. It's like I'm home. There is a learning process when you move to a new city in your own country, or if you move to a new nation in the world. And in that first 6 months, I attained a comfort level that I really appreciated when I got back. Incidentally, these thresher sharks come up from very deep early in the morning. We're at about 100 feet or 30 meters deep at this point in time. They come up to get cleaned by other fish that come and clean their coat, I guess, their skin. And then they go back. There was a huge hurricane Yolanda in 2013, and wrecked a lot of the areas up here. Uh, People were afraid that the thresher sharks would not come back, but it wasn't very long, and they were back at it. So back to the Philippines. All the data that I had researched on cost of living seemed to be fairly accurate. I had hoped to spend less on rent than what I ended up spending, but it's a choice I made in the type of place I want to live in. A condominium with security, clean, with a backup generator, either has a gym or a pool. If it has both, that's great. I've lived in 4 different condos. My budget every month is right around 1100. Many months I spend less than that. Uh, every third month or so I spend more than that because something comes up, a trip or an appliance I want to buy, something comes up to increase medical expenses. Relatively small for me here so far. English is another factor in my decision. The fact that many of the people here speak enough English so that you can communicate. Uh, just like any place in the world, everybody has different accents. They have different ways they pronounce vowels and syllables, and it is challenging at times and depend upon the person and the situation trying to get your point across, trying to communicate effectively. Uh, and I especially became aware of that when I went to Vietnam for 2 weeks recently, where very few people speak English, and you're down to pointing. And even if you're in a coffee shop where they only sell coffee and tea, and you say you want coffee, you say you want milk coffee or coffee milk, and they're confused. They bring you a menu that's all in Vietnamese, and they ask you to point to one. And you're just hoping you're pointing to the one that you actually want. So some of the menus had English underneath the Vietnamese. I think the same thing is true in Thailand, I've been told. In tourist areas, you will get many of the menus and signs in other languages. For instance, the town Nha Trang in Vietnam, many of the big Russian and Chinese area, there were stores that catered to the Chinese. There were stores that catered to the Russians, and they would have a Russian menu underneath the Vietnamese menu. I understood in Vietnam that almost every store that I went into, no one was going to be able to understand me. I was going to have to find what I wanted, or I would have to point at something, and if I asked a question, I wasn't going to get an answer in English. I am slowly learning some of the Bisaya language in Cebu and other parts of the Philippines. Cebuano or Bisaya, which are virtually the same thing, I believe, uh, is the local language. And Filipinos learn English as a second language, but it really is a case of use it or lose it. Some people will learn that second language very well, some not very well at all. And if you don't use it after you learn it, you're going to lose it. I've talked to Europeans that have known 2 or 3 languages, and they've told me the same. Uh, if you don't use your French, you're going to lose it. There are things to do in the Philippines, places to go and things to see and things to do. And if you're bored in the Philippines, means you're not trying very hard. You have seas and mountains and everything in between. You've got tourist sites, you've got more remote sites, you've got the big cities, and you've got the provinces, the country life, and everything in between. And the cost of most of those activities is really quite reasonable. I think this 4 or 5 hour motorcycle tour of Malapascua Island, there was 3 with the driver and 2 others on each of these motorbikes. I think it cost each of us 400 pesos, about $8 US. You can rent a motorbike in many areas of the Philippines for 300 to 400 pesos a day if you decide to ride one yourself. Political stability in the Philippines is reasonably stable. There are during election times there is some violence. It's a family and tribe oriented society, and families and clans in some of these areas hold on to that power that they have very fiercely. If somebody else decides they're going to run for a position where your family, your clan has had power for many, many years, there might be some violence involved. I think there was 13 killings during the last elections. I think down in Mexico it was 133 or something like that. But most of that won't affect the average tourist or expat. Thailand, I think uh, about 4 years ago, I think they had a military coup. The military came in and took over the government, and that type of thing happens on a regular basis in Thailand. I think there again, unless a person starts getting involved in those activities, you're probably safe. If you stay away from the protests, demonstrations, that type of thing, you're probably safe. Um, they've had some down in the south where they have the Muslim separatist type uh, groups. They've, they've got some issues. They've had a bombing or two in Thailand in the last few years. Vietnam, the communist country, relatively stable, but they have recently cracked down on some of the dissidents. I think they've thrown a blogger into jail because they didn't appreciate his push for democracy. Cambodia is come under scrutiny from the international community. I think they're under one-party rule. They've outlawed the opposing party and thrown some of those people in jail. And I think there could be some issues. Probably isn't going to affect the average tourist because they rely on a lot of those tourist dollars as well. And risk and calamity is something a person should think about. There are places in the world where your risks go way up because of natural and unnatural things. Unnatural reminds me of every time I see foods in the stores that say natural ingredients. I like to ask them that. I'm looking for the unnatural ingredients. Where do you keep them? Anyway, there are risks involved any place you live. When you wake up, when you go to bed, there are risks living. Where you live can greatly affect the risk that you look at every day. If you live at the bottom of a mountain where there's a lot of rain, one day that mountain might come down on top of you, a landslide. And it's happened here in our heavy rains a couple of times. Here in the Philippines, not so many years ago, it happened in the state of Washington. A whole hillside came down. I think there was about 25 people that lost their lives in that one. Many, many, many houses, nice houses. This is Siquijor Island. If you live on the east side of the Philippines and the northeast side of the Philippines, you're more apt to get hit by typhoons. If you live in the shadow of an active volcano, you increase your risk. If you live in an earthquake zone, and that's something that they're learning more about each year, even in California. They're finding new faults, and the way faults are connected. There's a cemetery on the right there, and anyway, how you live your life, what part of a city you live in, what part of a province, how you handle yourself. Are you out there making enemies? Any place you live in the world, you can be subject to calamities and emergencies, catastrophes, flooding, tornadoes, hail, landslides, volcanoes, earthquakes, and the list goes on and on. And the same goes for here in the Philippines. So you might choose wisely where you live. Find out if the area floods, especially if you're going to be on the first floor of a building. This particular night in Cebu City, a particular place, most of the city was not flooded, but this area, the heavy rain for much longer than usual, and a lot of the garbage on the sidewalks and streets clogged up the drains, so the water had no place to go. If you watch international news and international weather like I do, you understand that much of the world has had floods this year. Vietnam, much of Southeast Asia, China, different areas, they've had landslides and floods and crops ruined. Italy, different parts of Europe, different parts of the U.S. My hometown back in Minnesota, USA, they had a lot of rain this summer, and then Wisconsin. a lot of rain, they actually had to get out. I think they had to sandbag some of the streets, try to keep the flooding river from doing additional damage. When you choose to live someplace, build something, or rent long term, you should be aware of the potential hazards that you might encounter there. As far as the weather, we're in most of the country is in a tropical zone, uh, and you'll hear the term monsoons, oftentimes southwest monsoon, northeast monsoon, and that conjures up the thoughts that it's raining much of the day, every day. Well, that's not the way it is in most of the country. In fact, I was really surprised uh, that usually the rain, we have a hot, wet season, a hot, not as wet season, basically, in much of the country. You can go up in elevation, get into cooler areas. Uh, but basically, it means the wetter season, you will get 4 or 5 days a week where it rains. It usually might rain for 20 to 40 minutes and then it's over. Might do it early in the day, in middle of the day, afternoon. Just depends on what part of the country you're in and what the winds bring us. Um, the life goes on. It doesn't stop because of rain. Even the motorbikes, they put on their rain gear and they just keep going. Most of the streets are not flooded like this most of the time. Um, if you're in a typhoon situation, of course, you're going to have wind and more rain and more flooding in certain areas. I think we've had like 3 typhoons that have come through this general area of Cebu City since I've been here. I stayed up late, really early in the morning, a couple times, expecting to watch this big typhoon come through, and really, there's been just average storms that have been windier and more rain than what the typhoons brought us. But in 2013, a large typhoon, Yolanda, came through. It did a lot of damage in the eastern islands and the north third of Cebu, the island of Cebu, and over on Bohol, right next to us. Many people in parts of the USA that live in hot, humid states, the Southeast in particular, will tell you that it's probably hotter and more humid, more uncomfortable there than it is here in most parts of the Philippines. I've adapted quite well. The weather, the heat and humidity was the one thing I was worried about, humidity in particular. It usually ranges below in the 60s, can get a little lower than that, but usually in the 70s percentile, 70 to 80, depending upon what's happening, of course. And I've adapted quite well. There are days that are oppressive, just like they are oppressive in many parts of the world when it's hot and humid. Medical and dental health is another important factor to consider. The bigger cities, Cebu City, Manila, of course, and other big cities, I'm pretty certain have some excellent hospitals, excellent doctors. Some of them have been trained in the U.S. as well. I've done a couple of videos, one on Maayo Hospital, which is actually caters to expats, foreigners, and you can probably find the specialist that you need. I know people who've had hip replacements and are very happy with the results. Dentistry also. They provide many of the types of things that you would want back there, anything from fillings to extractions to implants. I have friends who have had, I think one is going to be ordering an implant when he gets here. He's had some dental work done here, and I think he's choosing to have an implant. Anyway, that is another expense that you should consider as well in your budget, because sooner or later you will go to a doctor, a hospital, or a dentist, wherever you are in the world, unless you can learn to operate on yourself through YouTube videos, perhaps. There are some differences, and I think you probably find those in Vietnam and Thailand as well. Some hospitals will charge a foreigner rate. I I'm not aware that that is the case in the Philippines. I have not heard of that happening. Uh, there are retirees who have uh, a retirement card from the Philippines, get huge discounts on many types of things, medical wise, and even at restaurants. I don't think the average foreign expat would qualify for that. Maybe if you're married to a Filipino, you could be. Um, Things are a little different. Oftentimes, the hospitals are not fully air conditioned like we would expect, especially if you get out of the big cities, away from the newer hospitals. You may be sitting in a waiting room, waiting, and it might be a little bit uncomfortable. They just may have some fans going. Another thing that I found is it's often difficult to make appointments, although there are some hospitals that work by appointment. Mayo, Mayo here in Cebu City, I believe they are one of those hospitals. Many of the doctors will spend time in more than one hospital, so sometimes I think they have difficulty in meeting those appointments from what I've heard, because if they've got a certain number of people walking in, it's first come, first served. If they're expecting the average 5 people to show up for their 4 hours that they're at that hospital, and 12 show up, they will oftentimes stay until they see all those patients before they move on to the next hospital or clinic. And one thing I've found here is that usually when you buy pills, if you say you want one, it doesn't mean one container. It means you want one pill, and they sell them usually in the little cellophane, the packages where they're individually wrapped. That's probably because of the humidity. Probably if you had an open container, it wouldn't take too long before all that constant humidity would degrade the medicine. The big city pharmacies may or may not have the items that you want to purchase over the counter or otherwise. They may have a different type of generic. One term that'll drive you nuts here is out of stock. We're out of stock. Don't have that in. And they usually won't know if or when they're gonna get it in. I had one guy that was looking for sleeping pills. He was prescribed, I think, about his 6th try, and he had gone to hospitals and pharmacies, hospital pharmacies as well as regular pharmacies. He finally, at the 6th pharmacy, he finally found the item that was prescribed by a local doctor here. Another thing you may find, and this is in the city, this was probably the first clinic that I went to. Everybody told me, sir, you have to go to the hospital to get what you need. And I forget what it was, if I had a sore throat or I think I had some coughing and allergy type things, sinus infection probably. And I was walking down the street and walking convinced that sooner or later I would find a clinic on the street, and sure enough I did. I found this place. And look at the hours, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. and Saturdays 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. So those doctors oftentimes, this particular one had a store. I think him and his wife sold cakes. Probably made more money selling cakes than they did in the medical business. I have found medical expenses in general to be relatively low. Doctor's calls usually cost anywhere from 400 to 800 pesos, $8 to $16 for an initial doctor's call. My lung x-rays cost me 800 pesos, 16 US dollars. I think I spent probably 20 or 30% of what I would spend on dental bills here. Do you need an ambulance? You may get one relatively quickly, or you might not. You might want to find your own way to the hospital, depending upon where you're at and the particular ambulance services available in your area. You should check that out. And why do I stay in the Philippines? I am convinced. You have to live someplace, and there's pros and cons to every place that you can be. Cost of living and comfort level is important. Uh, I can get the foods, a lot of the foods I like here. Some of them cost me much more because they're imported. But there's a comfort level in the Philippines. The fact that the people are welcoming, the government is welcoming, the people are friendly and welcoming. That's a big thing. The fact that they speak, many of them speak usable English, and I'll upset somebody by using that term, but everybody has a different. Everybody that speaks English around the world, they have different accents. They use different vowel sounds. They treat the English language differently, and you feel freer here. I've heard many people say that they feel more freedom here in the Philippines than they do back in a lot of their other countries in the U.S. and North America and European countries. You can meet so many people from so many other countries here who are also very unique individuals because just the fact that most of them, the fact that they pick up and move halfway around the world, many of them, Australians, they don't make such a long trip, but some very, very interesting people here, Filipinos as well as other foreigners, and I'm comfortable here. I'm convinced that most of my important needs can be met here. And anyway, thank you for watching. I'm interested in your comments. Please share the video. Please subscribe. Safe travels to you all wherever you're at, and we'll see you next time.